The Madness of Love, a novel written by the British writer Katharine Davies, based on and inspired by Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, was first published in 2004 in the United Kingdom with the decidedly more prosaic and mundane title, A Good Voyage. The following year it was reprinted and renamed The Madness of Love, although the same bewitching knotted mass of hair front cover was maintained for both editions. Davies' novel is set in the small coastal village of Illerwick and begins with the dramatic visualisation of a cliff-top suicide. The bulk of the action is set in the village's secondary school. Melody Vi is the popular inspirational head teacher who takes compassionate leave following the death of her brother Gabriel. Leo Spring is a wealthy, eccentric musician, also resident in the village. He believes he is passionately in love with Melody and impulsively employs Valentina, an English literature graduate with a boy's haircut, disillusioned with life, and her brother Jonathan, who has left London to return to their childhood home of Sri Lanka, to initially be his gardener and then also plead his love to Melody on his behalf. Melody becomes mesmerised by the apparently androgynous Valentina, while still maintaining no romantic interest whatsoever in Leo Spring. Those of you with a working knowledge of Twelfth Night will quickly see parallels with the main characters of Shakespeare's comedy. Melody is a reincarnation of Olivia, the countess who has stated that she will mourn for 7 years following the death of her brother. Leo Spring is Duke Orsino, who believes himself to be hopelessly in love with Olivia, whilst Valentina is Viola, who disguises herself as Cesario to ensure her survival following her shipwrecked arrival on a strange new island. The Madness of Love uses a multiple narrative structure, which enables the audience to glean a detailed insight into the minds of 6 characters: Melody, Leo, Valentina and Jonathan, and 2 others. Mr. Bowes is the bland, officious Jobsworth deputy head at Illerwick Secondary School, who harbours a secret desire for the school's headmistress, Melody Vi, and on one occasion masturbates in her classroom by her desk. This act is unfortunately seen and overheard by a pupil, Fitch, who later conspires with some friends, including Susie, who fancies Fitch like mad, to change the wording of a party invitation from evening dress to fancy dress. The bland, conservative, conventional Mr. Bowes initially decides not to go to Leo Spring's party, but changes his mind when he receives what he thinks is a personal letter from Melody urging his attendance, but is actually a clever forgery from Susie. Fitch is a more sensitive version of Shakespeare's Sir Toby Belch, Susie is the sharp Maria, and Mr. Bowes is, of course, Malvolio, the Countess Olivia's steward, who is cruelly humiliated by Maria's hilarious letter urging ceaseless smiling and yellow stockings. So how does Davies adapt, transform and modernise Shakespeare's Malvolio within the figure of the secretly masturbating yet oh so respectable on the outside deputy head of Illerwick Secondary School, Mr. Bowes? Well, stay tuned, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare. Our early impression of Mr. Bowes is that he is an insensitive, inflexible individual. He is first mentioned in chapter 2 of The Madness of Love within Fitch's narrative. Bowes enters Melody Vi's classroom to whisper to her that something terrible, and we infer this from the previous chapter and what follows, has happened to her brother. Fitch describes her reaction. She made a small nose in the back of her throat. No one was writing now. They watched her go pale. Fitch hated him. Anyone else would have spoken to her outside. It doesn't seem to have occurred to Bowes that such a tragic message should be delivered privately, rather than in front of an audience of open-mouthed teenagers. According to Fitch, Bowes is unique in not having the emotional intelligence to consider a more appropriate venue to deliver such terrible news. This insensitivity is seen in a different way in chapter 13, when Fitch describes his own inability to complete his maths homework, or indeed understand numbers altogether. He inadvertently wrote them back to front and created disasters, explosions of numbers which caused Mr. Bowes to fly into rages the next day. To a more enlightened teacher, Fitch's difficulties merit at least a different teaching approach and referral to explore a possible diagnosis of dyscalculia. However, Bowes is clearly a man with a rigid, unimaginative approach to teaching, and we later glean his life as a whole. He seems to find it virtually impossible to empathise with others, whether it is a senior colleague who has just lost her brother or a pupil struggling in his class, and as a result finds himself losing control when things occur which he finds difficult to understand. Malvolio's role as a steward in Twelfth Night has some pertinent parallels with Bowes as a teacher. Both men are in respectable positions within their community, as exemplified by Malvolio's steward's chain and by Bowes' position as a deputy head teacher. Both men are expected to behave responsibly, with Malvolio a senior servant in a countess's household and Bowes a role model to his pupils. Moreover, both men are in positions of inferiority within their institutions, Malvolio to his mistress Olivia and Bowes to the head teacher Melody Vi. And some close analysis of the early scenes of Twelfth Night show how Davies has moulded Bowes' character closely on Shakespeare's niggardly, rascally sheep-biter. Whereas Bowes' insensitivity is seen in his abject failure to usher Melody Vi out of her classroom before telling her about the tragic death of her brother, Malvolio's insensitivity is seen in his withering indictment of Olivia's fool, Feste. When asked to comment on his wit, he responds, "I marvel your ladyship takes delight in such a barren rascal. Look you now, he's out of his guard already. Unless you laugh and minister occasion to him, he is gagged." The verb marvel indicates astonishment at the very possibility of enjoying anything Feste says, and more specifically, he goes on to state that his fellow household member is incapable of generating amusement unless he is fed appropriate opportunities. This latter criticism is both damning and arguably unfair. Surely the best humour is impulsively and personally generated out of specific comments made by people present at that time. Malvolio rather unsportingly seems to be suggesting that Feste is only funny when those around him are willing him to be so. This may or may not be true, but again, isn't that the case with any stand-up comedian, presumably the modern equivalent? As a teacher, a key part of the job, especially within a modern state school context, is keeping control within the classroom. However, it becomes clear that Bowes is unable to do this, possibly due to his previously discussed inability to empathise with those he teaches. In chapter 14, with the head teacher Melody Vi away on compassionate leave, Bowes' narrative reveals it was difficult to run the school without her. The children were taking advantage of her absence to play merry hell. As the story develops, these difficulties multiply, and we learn that there are waves of talking that he cannot stop. He has resorted to desperate measures. He has made large boys stand on school chairs. The imagery of waves of talking suggests that remorseless, repeated patterns of low-level disruption have taken root naturally within his classes, making teaching far more difficult, and equally importantly, slowly poisoning the inner well-being of a man who has no other potential for fulfillment other than his profession. The futility of making large boys stand on school chairs, something which is not in any glossy classroom management brochure, and is also highly unlikely to result in anything other than deep-rooted resentment, highlights Bowes' desperate desire for order, which is shared by Shakespeare's Malvolio. In Act 2, Scene 3, the steward bursts into his fellow household members in full drunken party mood and pompously tries to quieten them down. His parting line emphasises his own powerlessness. "Mistress Mary, if you prize my lady's favour and anything more than contempt, you would not give means for this uncivil rule. She shall know of it by this hand." These words inadvertently admit that he himself has no power of his own. Just as an impotent teacher might threaten a class with a visit from the head of year, so here Malvolio fails totally to curtail the carousing and instead limply vows to tell tales to someone with genuine authority, Olivia. Yet a crucial difference between the two is that Bose's failure to keep control is far more corrosive and destructive to his own self-esteem. In Act 2, Scene 5, in which Malvolio is overheard by Sir Toby, Sir Andrew and Fabian, shows that the steward has quickly forgotten the potentially humbling events of the previous night and is enjoying himself immensely, imagining a preposterous future. The job description of a steward in the employment of Olivia would appear to be keeping out unwanted visitors and catering for your mistress's every whim, with only a small proportion attempting to restrain drunken uncles. In sharp contrast, teachers see their pupils 5 days a week for significant chunks of the day. Classroom control is a fundamental part of the job, and if you struggle with this, you are likely to experience regular, misery-racked evenings. No wonder, and this is another change from Shakespeare's original, Bose resorts to alcohol. A novel, by definition, will always allow greater scope for revealing historical details and motivations of characters, especially one which contains multiple narratives. Not only is it much longer in terms of sheer number of words, but its structure allows more fluidity of movement between different time periods that could get confusing or cumbersome on stage. Hence, we have no background information whatsoever about why Goneril and Regan treat their father so appallingly in King Lear, or here in Twelfth Night, whether there may be a little more to Malvolio than just repressed pomposity. In The Madness of Love, Katharine Davies fills in some gaps about Malvolio's mind and past life, and uses the narrative form to paint a more three-dimensional character who starts the story as a recovering alcoholic and quickly lapses into his old ways. Following the stress of being caught masturbating by a pupil in school, Bose thinks back to his early days after university, drinking alone in his flat in Kilburn, the quick nips before work, the sickness of self-loathing. The latter phrase gives the reader a glimpse into the deeply unhappy man who lurks behind the facade of respectable, inflexible dogmatism, and contrasts antithetically with an almost identical phrase used to describe Malvolio in Twelfth Night. Following his pompous tirade against Fester, Olivia describes him as sick of self-love. If we concur with this description, and the genuine joy in his Act 2, Scene 5 imaginative presumptions would indicate that we should, then Bose becomes a figure of greater pathos and depth than his Shakespearean inspiration. Someone who genuinely thinks he is morally superior to his compatriots and looks down on them deserves to be mocked and brought down several pegs or two. However, someone who puts on a display of haughtiness, whose job is a stressful one, demanding a degree of authoritarianism, and who deep inside is sick of self-loathing as opposed to self-love, is far more worthy of our pity and humanity. Some of his pupils may well think that he so loves himself, but they are wrong. Bose's narrative, slowly but surely, builds up a picture of a man with a wretched life. The emptiness of his out-of-school existence is summed up in an evening routine of talking to the blank face of the television and heading into the kitchen to get his whiskey and to force down a tin of vegetable soup. Loneliness screams out of the reference to the television's metaphorical blank face, his only companion, it would appear, whilst the verb phrase force down, used in combination with such a depressing meal, suggests that alcohol has put an iron vice in the desperate to be respectable and respected teacher. Bose may be more of a three-dimensional character than Malvolio. The latter in some productions is little more than a half-naked pantomime villain in yellow football socks. But in many ways he is still horribly unpleasant. Yes, we can't help but feel pity for his alcoholism and depressingly lonely existence. But, like his Shakespearean equivalent, he has some deeply unattractive character traits. Just as Malvolio brought Fabian out of favour with my lady about a bear baiting here, and bizarrely brought some legal action against the captain that did bring Viola first on shore, so Bose, in the playground, takes out his hangover on the smallest children and throws board rubbers which injure his pupils. These men may be petty bullies, small-minded tyrants, yet in their own ways they are competent and useful. During the interval of his school's production of, yes, you've guessed it, Twelfth Night, Bose appeared wearing a sou'wester and ferried pots of tea around. He clearly has no taste for drama, but has a role to play as a senior adult representative of his school. Head teacher Melody Vi has whimsically chosen to stage the play outside. Predictably, it pours with rain. Yet Deputy Head Bose, without any fuss, is on hand to dish out refreshment to show his school knows how to treat parents and guests. But if only they could control the weather. Malvolio is the same, given instructions by his mistress not to admit any visitors following her self-absorbed decision to mourn some more for her lost brother. He follows her orders to the letter and cheerfully makes up a load of rubbish dependent on the cooler. On meeting his match face with the determined to get in Viola, Malvolio recounts, "I told him you were sick. He takes on him to understand so much and therefore comes to speak with you. I told him you were asleep. He seems to have a foreknowledge of that too and therefore comes to speak with you." So both Malvolio and Bose are deeply loyal to their bosses. A degree of conscientious competence is in their natures. But they're not just loyal. They also harbour secret yearnings for these powerful women. In chapter 14, Bose has just completed a tiring day at school, which culminated in a lesson teaching Melody Vi's class. Reflecting on the day's difficulties, he picked up the board rubber and hurled it out at the space where their goading faces had been. The futile act of throwing the board rubber suggests that he has pent up feelings and emotions that he needs to unleash. Even after his pupils have left, he still visualises their antagonism and disruptive attitude towards him. And so, although his subsequent masturbating in the classroom and imagining Melody's hair falling over him, her soft breast against his mouth, is totally unacceptable, it can be explained, but not justified, to a certain extent by the hugely frustrating day he has just had. He needs to release some of this bottled up tension, which can only ever be inadequately discharged by occasional shouting and board rubber lobbing. Nonetheless, it is clear that the masturbating is not just the unfortunate consequences of a dreadful day. Bose undoubtedly has a penchant for Melody in particular, as shown by his creepy, voyeuristic flicking through her neatly filled-in register, tracing the delicate handwriting on the label of her mark book with his little finger, and worst of all, his licking the spine of her diary with the tip of his tongue. These actions cross all the unspoken boundaries of professionalism. Bose has no business to be snooping through a colleague's desk, let alone using it as a stimulus to muster up a pallid erection. Of course, changing attitudes to sex and relationships means that any writer writing in the 21st century would feel more comfortable with explicit references to intimate sexual acts than those writing 400 years earlier. Yes, Shakespeare loves a filthy sexual pun. Think of Malvolio's own reference to Olivia's very C's, her U's and her T's. But both the time period and the fact a play is performed live on stage would have made equivalently detailed and explicit descriptions of the build-up to and the actual act of chalky masturbation impossible in Twelfth Night. Nonetheless, it is clear that Malvolio likewise secretly lusts for his powerful boss, although his hankerings seem far more motivated by a desire to share Olivia's power and financial prosperity than any particularly sexual urges. In Act 2, Scene 5, he imagines having come from a daybed where I have left Olivia sleeping, which may or may not imply some completed sexual activity between the two of them. However, the very fact that his imagination moves on so rapidly to giving orders to his officers and his own indolent actions whilst he waits for these to be carried out suggests that Olivia as a catalyst for social advancement is far more significant than Olivia as a woman who needs ravishing. Bose and Malvolio may not realise it, but people who come into close proximity with them every day and who possess malevolent feelings towards them have picked up on these feelings of desire. This knowledge enables the likes of Maria in Twelfth Night and Susie in the madness of love to concoct elaborate scams which will ultimately result in the humiliation of the men they so dislike. In the madness of love, Leo Spring has arranged an indolent party at Beach House, ostentatiously to celebrate both his birthday and the beginning of the transformation of his garden to former glories. However, his main hope is that the party will result in the culmination of years of frustrated idle fantasies, a romantic relationship with the guest of honour, Melody Vi, someone he has known since childhood and who herself has memories from her youth of Leo's family's garden as magical and mystical. Fitch, the teenager who witnessed Bose masturbating, is in charge of delivering the party invitations and doesn't object when Susie asks whether she can borrow Bose's invitation. She duly changes 2 key details from the original invitation on the computer: the time from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. and the dress code from evening dress to fancy dress. In addition, Susie plays another little trick on Bose, which we infer from a few chapters later and Bose's own narrative, is a forged letter purportedly from Melody urging his attendance. What is fascinating about both Bose and Shakespeare's Malvolio is how easily they are fooled. Whilst Bose claims that he would recognise Melody's italics anywhere, clearly not if he can be so effortlessly convinced by a teenage amateur's forgery. What really seems to sway him is the use of the same type of her perfume. We learn that she had sprayed it with her perfume, only lightly, but it was definitely there. He describes the best moment was the moment when he had opened it and the smell had come flooding into his dark hallway like light. That was something he knew he would never forget as long as he lived. These words both highlight Bose's naivety. After all, it would only take an innocent question from a pliable teenager to a female teacher keen to be a role model to find out the latter's favourite perfume and the desperate lack of fulfilment in his life. The light waft of perfume coming from the letter symbolises far more than just a nice smell or a pleasant fragrance. For Bose, it represents future hope and a gigantic shift away from current miserable darkness into almost heavenly light. Whereas for Malvolio, Olivia represents an opportunity for naked social climbing. Bose believes a relationship with Melody would transform not only his life, but also his own incredibly negative view of himself, his own identity. He ends the chapter by imagining himself looking into Melody's eyes at the fancy dress party, both of them disguised, but truly themselves at last. The knowledge of Bose's inner wretchedness and the fact that Susie's forged letter acts as a catalyst to the poor man pinning all of his hopes on a relationship with Melody to become a different person altogether leaves the reader with an enormous sense of pity and pathos. We may not particularly like the man or choose to share a beer with him, but our intimate insight into his deep, desperate unhappiness cannot fail to move. Our reaction to Malvolio being tricked is not quite the same. Maria pens an entertaining letter to the unknown beloved, signed with the dreadfully crass oxymoron, the fortunate unhappy, which is read out in full on stage. Susie's forgery in the madness of love is only referred to. The letter is brilliantly written and so ridiculously melodramatic and over the top that it is impossible not to partly buy into the whole project. Early on it states sententiously, "Thy fates open their hands. Let thy blood and spirit embrace them, and to inure thyself to what thou art like to be, cast thy humble slough and appear fresh." The use of personification to describe Malvolio's fates, the pseudo-noble nouns of blood and spirit, and the hilariously unnecessary command for Malvolio to throw off humility, he has never possessed any, play up to the steward's artificially high sense of self-worth so brilliantly that it is impossible not to respect Maria's ingenuity and humour. And so, whereas the lack of a similarly hilarious letter in The Madness of Love allows us to ponder more about the potential effects of such a letter on its victim, in Twelfth Night, the audience is too carried away by the carnival atmosphere of fun and revelry to worry too much about outsiders. Nonetheless, as with Bose, we marvel at just how easily Malvolio is duped. whereas Bose sees the perfume as conclusive evidence. Malvolio is convinced by the use of Olivia's official wax seal, which anyone in the household could get hold of and use if they so chose. He cries enthusiastically, "Soft! And the impressure, her Lucrece, with which he uses to seal. 'Tis my lady!" Olivia's sealing ring contains an imprint of Lucretia, a Roman heroine, and Malvolio, wishing to believe that the letter is aimed at him and possessing a remarkable belief in his own moral integrity and worth, quickly and erroneously concludes that the letter is genuine. Both Malvolio and Bose's assumptions about the authenticity of their respective letters result in spontaneous bursts of happiness that almost certainly neither had previously experienced. In Twelfth Night, Malvolio disowns the malevolence implied in his name by unleashing an endorphin-packed sequence of future proclamations. I will be proud. I will read prolific authors. I will baffle Sir Toby. I will. Whereas in The Madness of Love, Bose rejects the measured restraint of a lifetime by running down the street, filled with a surging energy that could have taken him anywhere. He threw down his blazer on the grass and lay in the sun like a mad dog with his newspaper over his face. He did not care who saw him. He let his fantasies run riot. However, both reader and audience know through dramatic irony that such ecstasy is based on unsound premises, that the two men are loved by their powerful respective bosses, and as such will be short-lived. Sure enough, their unquestioning belief in their letters leads to their downfall, an immediate shift from bliss to despair, and very public humiliations. In The Madness of Love, following some meticulous arrangements to procure the right outfit, Bose dresses up as a clown, and we later learn that this was explicitly suggested in Susie's forged letter. Predictably enough, the other party goers are highly amused at seeing such a reliably conservative pillar of the community in this attire at an evening dress party. Davies describes their reaction. The laughter began as a tiny burble, but soon it swept through the crowd like a cold east wind. The simile highlights the chilling, rapid movement of the laughter through the partygoers, just as we all feel instantly the effects of a cold wind, so everyone present is rapidly drawn to and amused by the sight of the local school's deputy head teacher looking so extraordinary out of character. Bose tries to make a hasty retreat, but compounds his embarrassment by falling in his long clown shoes. Bose's humiliation is at a one-off event and in front of his entire community. In Twelfth Night, Malvolio's humiliation is more gradual, following some out-of-character, remorseless smiling, flauntings of yellow stockings, and apparently nonsensical references to greatness. Olivia fears for her loyal steward's sanity and crazily asks Sir Toby to organise some of her people to have a special care of him. Does she know nothing about Sir Toby's feelings towards her steward? Sir Toby duly obliges by having Malvolio imprisoned in a dark room and bound as a madman. Malvolio is therefore forced to resort to frantic pleas for help, pen and paper, whilst being tormented with regular accusations of insanity. He cries out in desperation, "They have here propertied me, keep me in darkness, send ministers to me, asses, and do all they can to face me out of my wits." Whereas Susie's aim in The Madness of Love is merely to humiliate Bose and give herself and her friends a good laugh in the process, Malvolio's words here suggest something more sinister. Not content with humiliating Malvolio by deceiving him about Olivia's supposedly secret desires for him, Sir Toby and Feste go a step further by toying with and attempting to destabilise his mental health. In Act 3, Scene 4, Sir Toby vows to strengthen Olivia's belief that her steward is mad for our pleasure and his penance, and evidence of this is seen in deliberately nonsensical lines from Feste, speaking as fictional priest Sir Topas, including this description of Malvolio's dark prison. "Why, it hath bay windows transparent as barricadoes." The simile doesn't make sense. Barricades or barricadoes are not transparent or see-through, and moreover, Malvolio's underground cellar doesn't have any windows. Feste's aim is clearly to confuse Malvolio and unsettle his senses, purely for the amusement of himself and those listening to him on and off the stage. And so a modern audience especially is likely to feel uncomfortable with Sir Toby and Feste's controlled cruelty in Twelfth Night, which contrasts with the more spontaneous, youthful, let's have a laugh at our teacher's expense approach of Susie and her peers in The Madness of Love. Indeed, in Davies' novel, there is both a far more obvious sense of conscience about what has happened to Bose and clearer consequences for the perpetrators. In Fitch's narrative, we learn that everyone was laughing, but there was something terrifying about what had just happened, and they all knew it. The adjective terrifying is explicit. Susie's written forgeries have taken on a significance beyond that of a teenage practical joke. It suggests that the children recognise how their actions may have impacted upon Bose's life and well-being in a far more permanent way than they had ever anticipated. And hence Fitch takes the trouble to go round personally to his house to find out how he is. This sensitivity is simply not present in Shakespeare. Sir Toby Belch decides he would like to bring the trickery to an end, but this has nothing to do with a concern for Malvolio's well-being. He tells Maria, "I would we were well rid of this knavery, for I am now so far in offence with my niece that I cannot pursue with any safety this sport to the upshots." So Sir Toby wants the sports to stop. Notice how this noun dehumanises Malvolio and refers to him as a toy to be played with, simply because Olivia has got sick and tired of her uncle's general behaviour in her house and may well finally decide to get rid of him. The consequences for Susie's trick in The Madness of Love are public and explicit. Melody Vi hauls the teenagers into her head teacher's office and told them that she was suspending them and that their parents had been told to stop them seeing each other until half-term. She averted her eyes from their misery. In contrast, in Twelfth Night, Olivia concludes that Malvolio has been most notoriously abused, and Orsino issues this general command: pursue him and entreat him to a peace. Yet any justice for Malvolio is not shown on stage, and it is clear that both Olivia and Orsino's priorities will lie elsewhere, naturally enough in cementing their own newly found relationships and loves with Sebastian and Viola respectively. Twelfth Night, January the 6th, or 12 nights after Christmas, may have represented a time of reckless licence abandon for the Elizabethans and Jacobeans. But Malvolio's treatment and lack of justice at the end of the play leaves the modern audience at least with an uncomfortable feeling that if not something terrifying has occurred, but that something certainly distressing, something wrong, and something that should not just be brushed to one side. This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production exploring Katharine Davies' transformation of Shakespeare's Malvolio in The Madness of Love. Thanks for watching.